Thanks for joining us this week on Email Geeks at Home Drinking Coffee. Join your hosts Chris Marriott and Paul Schreiner each week as they talk email marketing, life, purpose, faith, but mainly email marketing. If you're looking for some normalcy in these crazy times, you've come to the right place.
Welcome back to Email Geeks at Home Drinking Coffee. It's even kind of weird to say that. We've had a little bit of a break, which has honestly been really great. I'm Paul Schreiner. With me, as always, is my esteemed colleague,
Chris
That's
Marriott.
what he said. There it is.
And, as Paul said, there has been a hiatus. The program's been on hiatus, and clearly standards have plummeted during that period of hiatus. We used to be well-groomed. In the early days of the season 1, season 2, we were well-groomed. We were shaven. We were both in professional environments, not on a screened-in porch in Alabama or God knows where, Boise, Idaho. And so we apologize for the standards slipping. But the good news is the content just keeps getting better and better.
For sure. And what I'll say is, like, we started this with the idea of, like, what's COVID like? How are we going to respond to COVID? What's that like? And now that we're kind of on the backside of that hill a little bit, now we're looking at how do we recover from COVID? And that's the whole sort of concept of this series for the next couple of episodes. And so this fits really well. Like, we're here in Idaho with family reconnecting. It's been 2 years. And I know there's a lot of people that are feeling that way. And so, our goal for the next couple of episodes is to sort of track some of that.
Yeah. So before we introduce our guest and get to the program, and again, let me apologize in advance for continuity once again thrown entirely out of the window. Paul and I will look very different when the actual program starts, and it isn't because we're quick change artists.
No, we are not.
The veil has been lifted. This recording is not the same day.
How many people are hitting cancel right now? I'm done with these two.
They try to fool us, but they're at these cheap stunts. Anyway, who's our sponsor today, Paul?
Well, it's our friends at Audience Point, which is also, who I work with for and help start the company up. We've been doing fantastic stuff with data, and we had the conversation today, right? Like, we are very much taking data and sort of rehashing it, figuring out where and what the next big thing is. And so, honestly, so excited to share the things coming out, but thanks to Audience Point for making this happen.
We have another sponsor, though, don't we?
Do we? Oh, my goodness. Could you tell us about him, Chris?
Yeah, apparently our junior sponsor is Email Connect, which is my company. And as many of you do know already, we help brands in the MarTech vendor selection process. And that's what we do. So today we're kicking off season, I believe it's 6. If not, we'll correct that in the post show.
Right. Just he'll say 5.
Yeah, right. Producer David you'll hear producer David saying the right number over my face. But today we have one. I was very excited for this episode. We're having best-selling author Nina Teicholz, New York Times best-selling author of the book, The Big Fat Surprise. And it's a book that changed the way my wife and I eat, has changed the way we have eaten forever. It's a fantastic book. She's a great guest. I think you're going to be fascinated by what you learned today about what the government tells you we should be eating and what science tells us we should be eating. And this isn't one of those left-right. This is one of those, big government and real science. And very excited.
I think it's going to be a great show, and so excited to share it.
Great. So we'll see you on the other side. Welcome back to Email Geeks at Home Drinking Coffee. Today, I can't tell you how excited I've been for this episode. Today, we're joined by one of my heroes, and I say that in all sincerity, Nina Teicholz. She's a New York Times best-selling author of a book that changed my life and my wife's life, and probably everyone within hearing of us over the last 6-7 years, because we talk incessantly about it, which we'll get into. A book called The Big Fat Surprise, which economists named the top science book of 2014. Her advocacy and research has led to a profound rethinking on what is proper nutrition, what is the proper diet, particularly around the consumption of fat and saturated fat, and does it cause disease or not? And she's written in a number, besides writing this book, Big Fat Surprise, she's written a number of op-eds, articles for various publications, including the Times, the New Yorker, the British Medical Journal, Wall Street Journal, etc. She's found, well, not lastly, I could go on and on, but lastly, for my intro, she's the founder and executive director of the Nutrition Coalition, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit without any industry backing. And these are key words that we'll get to, without any industry backing. And she's working to promote, and again, another key phrase that we're going to drill down, Nina, evidence-based nutrition policy. And I pulled those words from your LinkedIn, the profile, the evidence-based nutrition policy, because it's interesting that you felt the need to put a qualifier before nutrition policy, but we're going to get into that today because I think there is a need based on some of what you've seen and learned in reaction to your writings, that evidence-based is probably not used often enough. So we'll come back to that. What I really want to do is let's just start with the idea of fat and its role in our diet. And so I'll start with, my wife has always been very interested in nutrition. And so a few years ago, what year did this book come out?
2014.
Okay, so 2014, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal, and there's a book review on it, on your book. And I thought, I'm going to get my wife. She's always talking nutrition, this, nutrition, that. Here's one big fat surprise. She's saying, don't eat red meat, don't eat bacon, don't eat all of this stuff. And I thought, well, I'm going to give her this book and just, see how she reacts to that. So the book came in, and I actually grabbed it and perused it and was like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And I gave it to her, and fully expecting her to push back and go, oh, vegan this, vegan that. But the book was just unbelievably convincing that everything we'd been taught since the 1980s on about what we should
earlier
eat.
than that.
Well, but the first, I've got a chart here that we'll get to later that I stole from.
Yeah.
You recognize that? That's your chart. But really, yeah, starting earlier in terms of the 50s and Eisenhower and his heart attack. But since the government got involved, basically, yeah, I'll just go on a limb here and say everything that they've told us is the exact opposite of what it should be. So, and I'm sort of pontificating here. So I'm going to take a step back and say, and ask you, what got you interested? This is so controversial, continues to be controversial. What got you interested in nutrition policy to begin with? And what led you down a road where you pretty much came out counter to everything, but with evidence-based research?
Well, first, thank you for having me on your show, both of you. It's great to be here. And thank you for that super kind introduction. And yes, it is incredible, I think, the journey that I've been on in nutrition, which I think, like your wife, I started off this journey in the early 2000s, having been assigned an article by Gourmet magazine. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but I was I'm a journalist. I was assigned to write a story on trans fats, and I didn't know anything about dietary fat. I was a vegetarian, or I had not eaten red meat or butter for decades. And I came into this field just with a completely open mind, knowing nothing about anything in nutrition.
Sure.
I didn't know anything beyond what most people of my generation knew, which was definitely avoid fat. That's terrible for you. Will make you fat. Definitely don't eat red meat. Whatever it does to you, it's definitely bad. Don't eat bacon. So I was trying to get along on fruits and vegetables and whole grains and skinless chicken breasts and salads without salad dressing and like many people. And I was not thin. Like I was about 20 pounds heavier than I am now, even though I was running 6 miles a day or biking dozens of miles.
Yep.
So, but anyway, none of that was on my mind. I just thought that's the way I am. And I wasn't particularly interested in nutrition. So, but I was assigned this article, and that really put me down. It just sent me down the rabbit hole on dietary fats, because I started calling up scientists to ask them about fat. Well, why are we eating trans fats, and tell me about the low fat diet, and what do you think about fat in general? And the reactions by scientists were so bizarre to me. I mean, I interviewed people who would tell me about having their articles yanked from academic journals by somebody in the margarine industry, or people who had been visited by scientists who had come to harass them. I spoke to scientists who were hired to harass scientists at scientific meetings because those scientists were presenting results that were dangerous to the margarine or the vegetable oil industry. I had scientists hang up on me when they said, if you're going to challenge the low-fat diet, I can't even talk to you. So my father is an engineer. I grew up in a very kind of nerdy academic family. I always thought that science was this rational universe, and that we could have point and counterpoint and thesis and counter-thesis and all these things that I had to think about. And what I discovered instead was just like this wild west in the world of nutrition science. And that really intrigued my interest. And I got actually a book on my article when it came out in Gourmet magazine was the most read article in that magazine for decades. And I got a book contract to write about trans fats. But by the time I had learned so much about dietary fat, which was my interest, good fat, bad fat, non-fat, low fat, how much fat, what do you do? What do you do about that? I kind of ended up writing a book about saturated fats. And how they have been unfairly villainized. So that's the reason that we drink low-fat milk or eat low-fat yogurt, or we avoid red meat. It's all due to an effort to try to avoid saturated fats, which we've been told are the worst kind of fats. And along my journey of interviewing hundreds of scientists and reading thousands and thousands of articles going back to the 1920s or even earlier, I realized that those ideas had not been based on good science and were in fact wrong. And that everything we had been told about dietary fat was kind of upside down and backwards. And therefore that the advice that we're given about what is a healthy diet is also not true. It's not based on rigorous, solid evidence. This evidence-based, words that are easy to throw around. It's like, oh, my facts, your facts. We all want evidence-based everything. But the reality is, to give evidence-based advice, it has to be based on really good, solid kind of scientific data, which we can talk about if you want to. What is good scientific data and what is kind of weak data. But so it's been a really long journey. It took me almost 10 years to write that book. I bet. Because the research was so intense, but also because I went through waves and waves of self-doubt, thinking, how could I be right? How could this be right? I must be wrong. I have to go back and look at this 1,000 more times because I must be wrong. It can't be that 60 years of conventional wisdom about diet could be wrong. How can I be right? It didn't seem logical to me. But, since my book has come out, which is, I think, important to know, that there's really been no critique of my book that has undermined any of its basic statements or assertions, points, and the evidence that I presented in my book has now been published in academic papers, and it only gets stronger and stronger and stronger. This idea that saturated fats really are not, the idea that we should not eat those fats is not supported by any strong evidence.
Well, and I'm the poster boy, I think, for your whole theory. We ate grains, lots of pasta and rice and complex carbohydrates because that's what we were told to do. and we didn't eat a lot of red meat and a lot of saturated fats of any kind. And I remember every year going to my, and I worked out religiously, and every year I'd go to my doctor, and it'd be a drumbeat of you're a couple of pounds heavier, you're a couple of pounds heavier, a couple, and you talk about in the book the idea that when you eat, when you sustain a certain level of carbohydrate consumption on a daily basis, that's what's going to happen. And so I'm reading that in the book, and I'm thinking, that's exactly what's happened to me. And the minute I adopted what your book suggests, which is, or what you suggest, the minute I flipped it around and said, I'm not going to eat bread, I'm not going to eat pasta, I'm not going to eat rice, and I'm going to eat a lot more red meat, I'm going to eat a lot more, and I'm going to lower my fruit consumption dramatically.
Yep.
I lost 50 pounds in a year.
Wow.
I felt better too.
It just, I felt better, and the weight just, it was not, and I didn't think of it as a diet in the sense of diet being, a thing you intentionally do to lose weight. It was a diet of just changing the way
Lifestyle.
I ate and approached food. And, again, I became insufferable. So did my wife. We became insufferable because nobody wanted to be around, because that's all we talked about. You got to.
I'm so glad you've evolved from there, Chris.
We were advocates, and we are to this day, though we realized we were insufferable. But it really is true that, again, what you outlined in the book, that carbohydrates, there are so many reasons why a high carbohydrate diet, and I don't want to, I'll mangle the evidence, and it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that, but why a diet that focuses on carbohydrates is bad, the science of why, the medical reasons why that's bad, as opposed to, one that's low in carbohydrates. And again, I know Paul thinks he's running on again, but one of the most interesting things I took, the thing in the book that was most fascinating to me, was when you talk about the Inuit natives in, everybody's telling us, you got to eat grains, you got to eat vegetables, you got to eat fruit, you got to eat all this stuff. And here's an entire culture that eats nothing but whale meat. And they're until the Western civilization intruded and brought all their foods, these people, they had very little heart issues, or was non-existent. None of the things that Western scientists say happen if you eat a meat diet was going wrong with these people. And they were getting all the nutrients they needed because they were eating whale. Again, I learned this from you. They're eating whale meat, and the blubber stores what they eat, which is all plankton and plant-based. So they're getting their their needed plant nutrients from the meat they were eating, and they were perfectly fine. And it sort of, and to me, that was like, wow. That was the head exploding moment, that it really is, you don't need to eat all these grains, and here's a society that doesn't eat any.
Yeah, the first part of my book is like a series of just astonishing stories that when you come across them, you can't even believe they're true. Like the Inuit is one of them. What they eat, that 70% of their diet is fat, that they don't eat almost any plant food except for some spring berries
Right.
when they're out, and they're naturally out. And you think about that, like, well, actually, what kind of plant foods could any of us have eaten in non-tropical climates? I live in Connecticut, where you can't even get fruits or vegetables for 3/4 of the year, right? So, but the Inuit were discovered to be in perfect health by explorers who went and lived with them and spent years with them in the early part of the 1900s, and they were in good health. They lived on whales, seals, sea mammals. They ate the whole animal, and they were able. People would think, oh, what about the vitamin C? Where does the vitamin C come from? Because you get scurvy if you don't have vitamin C. But in fact, you can get vitamin C if you eat the whole animal, which is what these people did. And also, what impedes vitamin C absorption is eating a lot of carbohydrates, which they did not. They don't have grains, they don't eat pasta, they don't have rice or flour or any of that. So they were found to be in perfect health. And it's actually a really interesting story about the Harvard doctor who discovered, or who went and lived with them for several years, named Stefansson. He he wrote books about his experience with them. He felt he ate their diet. He felt he had never been in better health. He came back to the United States. Everybody thought he was nuts. This is in the 1920s. And so he devised an experiment where he and a colleague at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, they decided to go on an all meat and fat diet where they would be supervised. I think for the first 2 months, they were inpatient in the hospital, and they were supervised by a team of people who oversaw everything and made sure they didn't cheat. And then they spent the rest of their 10 months sort of outside, but eating nothing but meat and fat. And there were 6 papers published out of their experiment, finding them to be in perfect health. And this was, so astonishing to the medical establishment. Even at the time, they thought, how will these people not be dead, much less be in perfect health? But that's not, it's not a singular example. There's other examples. I talk about the Maasai warriors who are still living there, and another one, Samburu, is another tribe in Kenya and Uganda, and they were studied by a scientist from the University of Vanderbilt. He took their blood pressure, he looked at their cholesterol levels, he took EKGs of 600 of them and could not find, maybe a trace of a heart attack in one of the men who their cholesterol levels were very low. Their blood pressure was much lower than the average person in the United States to which they would be compared. And yet, what was their diet? Their diet was massive amounts of milk, meat, and blood. And that was it. They an estimated 70-80% of their diet was fat. They took no vegetable matter, as they said. The vegetable matter was reserved for the women, and they were in great health. And they were, they weren't like huge exercisers. I mean, they would the elder people would just kind of lay around the village and not do much. And so there are many, many examples of people surviving like this, which is not to say that there weren't also people surviving on diets with rice and grains as their basis, but just the fact that people could be healthy on this radically different diet kind of blows your mind open to the possibility. Yes. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we don't need to eat pasta and rice and grains as we're told we have to. And in fact, there are 3 macronutrients. All food is made up of 3 macronutrients. There's fat, protein, and then carbohydrate. So carbohydrate is found not only in starches and sugars, which is the obvious places, but also in fruit, which is really sugary, and then root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, onions. Of those 3, only 1 is not essential. In other words, you don't have to eat any of it, and that is carbohydrates. Wow. That you don't need any carbohydrates to survive, that your brain needs a tiny amount of glucose, which is the sugar, and your eyes need a tiny amount, but you can make your own glucose from the protein that you consume. So in fact, we have 0 basic need for carbohydrate. And yet in America, we were told, remember, everybody probably remembers or has some vague memory of the food pyramid that we were all given by the government starting in 1980. Well, the food pyramid came later, but the government guidelines, which really transformed everything. Yeah, there's that chart showing when obesity took off coincided exactly with the introduction of our government food policy called the Dietary Guidelines for America. As illustrated in the pyramid, that big bottom slab is all grains, pasta, rice, cereals. And we went from a nation in 1965 eating 39% of our calories of carbohydrates or less to now easily over 50% of our calories as carbs, which is, I think the increase has been 25%. And that's what we're told to eat. When we followed the guidelines. We not only did we increase carbs, but we decreased fat, we decreased saturated fat, we decreased meat.
What's frustrating?
We decreased red meat by 28%. Sorry, I think I froze there. We decreased red meat by 28%, and we decreased animal fats by 19% since 1970 till 2014. But just to say, I mean, we dramatically changed our diets. And just one more point, the sort of the conventional wisdom is like, well, we eat too much, we eat too many calories, we eat 274 more calories per day than we did in 1980, and all of that is true, but every single one of those calories is carbohydrates. I mean, what we have done is dramatically increase our carbohydrates, and there's now a large body of scientific literature showing that it's really the carbohydrates that drives the metabolic dysfunction that includes obesity, diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, and all these diseases that are now epidemic in which we suffer from.
Yep.
Well, and I think what was frustrating for me as kind of preparing for this is, we're talking about sort of the food pyramid and recommendations for how we eat, and it's how we arrived at that, right? It wasn't like, hey, this is what's best. It's big margarines flexing their muscles going, hey, we want to, because again, our economy, the way they are, and money drives things. They hire a pack and they push it through to say, hey, we need to eat more pasta, right? Big pasta, whatever, throwing out names. But I mean, that's the frustrating thing is it's not what's best for us, right? It's not what it makes us healthy or happy. It's special interest groups.
Yeah. So I think the history of nutrition science in this story is a little complicated in the sense that there was an early group of scientists who truly believed that saturated fats were bad for health. I think that they genuinely held that belief, and it was, I believe they were sincere in their initial belief. But at the same time, there were I sort of dug up really early signs of the food industry being involved at the same time. Yep. So actually the first recommendation not to eat saturated fat came from the American Heart Association in 1961. Well, who launched the American Heart Association as the huge nonprofit that we know it today? It was right. That's the first recommendation. Who launched that was Procter and Gamble. In 1948, they gave a huge amount of, they gave millions really through a radio contest to the American Heart Association. And what does Procter and Gamble make? They make vegetable oils. Well, when you tell all of Americans to stop eating or to dramatically decrease your saturated fats, you're telling them at the same time to eat unsaturated fats. And that means replace butter with margarine.
Margarine!
Right. Replace the fats you cook with, which would have been butter and lard really for American history. Replace that with Procter and Gamble's Crisco oil. And so those influences were in the American Heart Association, and the sugar industry was found to be giving money to Harvard. I mean, there are all these different industries that were definitely involved. And although there were well-meaning, well-intentioned scientists who were promoting these ideas, the involvement of the food industry is just inextricable to this whole process. And then the kind of the uglier part of this story is that as these ideas that saturated fat is bad for health, fat causes obesity, they were all tested in government-funded clinical trials, and they kept what we say, people think of as failing. They couldn't show that any of these
could prove causation,
correct, right? So they would have what's called null results, which is like, well, we didn't find that saturated fat caused heart disease, and when people went on low-fat diets, they didn't lose any weight, and so the results of these experiments were not successful from the government's point of view. And at that point, the story really takes a different turn, because at that point you see like trials being silenced, results not being published, things being hidden in the basement of NIH and never being published. You see really a different kind of turn in the story. One study where the government officials involved just came in one day and said, we're pulling the plug on this whole study because it's not coming out the way we want it to, or they didn't actually say that. And so now we have a generation of scientists who may not even know this history or are complicit in it. And I think all of this is much more now steered by the food industry than good science.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I grow corn, therefore, you should use corn oil.
Yeah. Right. Or I grow cereals, or I'm Kellogg's, or I'm General Mills, or I'm Nestle, where, most of my products are sugary candy. Or, I mean, Nestle is like a perfectly integrated company because they started you off with like sugary baby milk and then continue with all their other products. And then they sell you whatever formula you're supposed to drink once you get diabetes. So they're like, they've got you covered from
Right.
grade.
Well, and it's interesting, and you touched on it, the vitriol that has existed in this debate since it really became sort of a debate. And I know one of the villains of the story is Ansel Keys, and just mention him to my wife, and she goes off on a rant. She's read enough about him to know, and so from the very early on days, as you sort of hinted at, or talk, it is. There was a right side to be on, and there was a wrong side to be on. And regardless of the funding, if you were on the wrong side, you were going to be shot down, shut down, shouted down, and it's like a distant mirror to what we see continuing today in terms of some of the things that what you've been called, and other doctors who dare to challenge the orthodoxy that has grown up around this. And it is an orthodoxy. It is a dogma that has grown up around this, supported, as you say, by not only big food, but by big government. Your book also talks about, and this I find fascinating as well. And folks, we'll go back to the chart. Now this was a George, and correct me if I get the facts wrong, and I didn't even re-look at the book. This is how much your stuff stuck with me, but if I get a fact wrong, but George Mcgovern was a senator from South Dakota. And he headed up the Senate panel that was in charge of doing the food pyramid. And that was launched in 1980. And in reality, and you go through this book, those regulations were written by some junior staffer on his team. And what they weren't written by a scientist, some junior staffer with no nutrition background at all was kind of taking what was coming in, the wink and the nods, I'm sure, from these guys are giving us money, these guys aren't, and sort of crafted this Frankenstein pyramid based, again, not on the words. It wasn't evidence-based. It was just what they said it was going to be.
Yeah. So I mean, what you say is largely true. I mean, about how it happened. There was a junior staffer on this Senate Select Committee, and this guy was sort of verging into vegetarianism, and he was influenced by all these American Heart Association scientists. And so he was one of these people who felt that the meat industry was like the tobacco industry, and this is something that probably resonates with people today, but this is in the late 1970s when he just felt anything having to do with meat was terrible. And so he crafted what became the dietary guidelines. So his report was called the Dietary Goals, and it doesn't really matter, but eventually it became the Dietary Guidelines. But even at the time, senators really objected. They said, the science is not strong enough. We really don't know. This is very weak science. There are reputable scientists on both sides of the issue. I mean, even the senators really understood that this was a disputed issue. And at the time, this Harvard scientist who was very influential, called Mark Hegstead, who was influential with this young staffer, he spoke up and he said, well, we may not know all the facts, but it's too urgent a situation. We have to act. Well, it's a little bit like, what we've experienced with COVID. Like, we just have to act. We have to, we're not sure, short-term trials on the vaccine, whatever. It's just important. At the time, it was heart disease that everybody was so panicked about, because heart disease, which had been virtually non-existent in the early 1900s, had grown up to become the #1 killer in America, and nobody knew what caused heart disease. So heart disease was this emergency, and then cancer was also on the rise, another unknown, nobody knows the cause. Yep. It's another emergency. So there was this sense like we just have to do something. I mean, now in retrospect, it seems not only like sort of like bad policy, because at the time most Americans were actually pretty healthy. So our rates of obesity were in the low teens, right? Under 15%, maybe 12, lower for men, maybe 8%. And now we're nearing like 43% obesity, right? But when they took these emergency measures without enough knowledge, they were basically saying, well, we're just going to put everybody on this diet and hope it works. But they had no, and without understanding, this is the critical part of policies that are based on weak evidence. They couldn't imagine the unintended consequences. Mark Hegstead actually say, we cannot imagine the negative, that there could be any negative consequences.
Sure.
They couldn't imagine it. Now we have obesity at 43%. We have an epidemic of fatty liver disease that nobody ever could have seen. Cancer has gone, now through the roof. It is a huge childhood epidemic. So, that's what happens. It just happens again and again in the course of public health history, but there's this sense that you must do something. There's a demand by the public to do anything. And then you make what are ill-considered decisions without considering consequences. That's kind of what happened to us. And then so the whole United States went through this. We all became the subjects of this vast, uncontrolled experiment without our consent. We all went on, we're told we all went on a diet, low in fat, low in saturated fat. We all did that. And now we've been doing it for 40 years. And it's been a disaster, obviously. And instead of the government saying, look, we clearly got some things wrong, which is almost impossible for governments to do.
Yep.
Instead, they turn around and blame. This is the part of it that can be so upsetting to me, or one of the parts that's so upsetting, is they blame people for their obesity and diabetes. They say, you are failing to follow the guidelines. You're not trying hard enough. You are gluttonous and you overeat and you don't exercise enough. And, to which the answer is, there is no experiment showing that if you follow the guidelines, you'll get any healthier. And in fact, when they did this one experiment that I love particularly, that showed people who followed the guidelines perfectly were no healthier than people who were who were on a kind of a junk food diet, much higher in sugar. And that was a clinical trial, so a rigorous kind of trial. And it's also been shown that exercise, so the way we understand it now is that you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. Exercise for weight loss really is it's like 10% of the equation. That's mostly it's nutrition that is driving weight loss and weight gain. And the reason that we're all hungry and overeating and binging and up at night with the Haagen-Dazs, I don't know if anybody else.
I don't know what you're talking about.
It's because we were told not to eat the foods that are naturally satiating. And this is just a really key point that I want to slip in here, which is fat and protein are naturally satiating. So when you eat scrambled eggs with butter, pork chops, anything, that kind is the kind of food that it's very hard to overeat on that. And they've actually done experiments where they put a stack of pork chops in front of a bunch of subjects and said, you must eat these. People would eat one or two and just said, I cannot eat anymore. So those foods are naturally satiating for whatever reason. Whereas if you eat carbohydrates, cookies, crackers, chips, everything in the center of the aisles of the supermarket, you can't stop eating those. You can a whole bag of tortilla chips is not enough. And there's a couple reasons for that. But one of them is that they causes your sugar to go way up in your blood.
Oh, yeah.
Even whole grains causes your sugar to go up, and then once it's done with going up, it crashes down, and then you're in a sugar, you're in a pit, and you desperately need to raise your blood sugar again. You go on this roller coaster of blood sugar that just drives you on. That's kind of that is sort of what the addiction is to carbs. Fat and protein, your blood sugar is like this, so you're calm, and you are, you're not having these spikes and plunges. And also remember, we don't need carbohydrates. So when you're eating them, you're not giving your body any of the essential nutrients that it actually needs. your hunger is your body's way of telling you like, hey, I need some vitamin B and I need some vitamin A, and like I need things to function. If you're giving it carbs, your body doesn't need those to function.
Question.
So you're not getting the essential nutrient or the proteins or anything that you actually need to survive.
So question, and this is really curiosity, because we've had some elite athletes, ultra marathon runners on the show, really, really sort of that higher end. And I've always heard carb load, eat lots of carbs. It's going to be translated sort of while you're in that stage. Is that also, I mean, does that also fit into this discussion?
It does, because many athletes function that way, and they need to have that constant glucose. So glucose is the fuel that comes out of carbohydrates. Glucose is, a form of sugar. But you see those athletes who are dependent upon carbs, and they're eating those goo packs as they go along, and they're like constantly having to refuel themselves with glucose because glucose is their fuel source. And if you don't get it, they bonk, right? They just like the glucose, they run out of glucose and they just can't function. What is profoundly different about people who get off sugars and starches is that they shift their fuel source. Their fuel source is no longer glucose. They shift it over to something called ketone bodies, which is what your body makes when it is subsisting on fat and protein. And put just in the simplest terms, it's just like being a hybrid car. Like you can survive on glucose, but you're going to go through this up and down thing. Or you can survive on your ketones, which is basically it's your body fat. And why does it make more sense to survive on your body fat? Well, your fat is there as a source of energy when you need it. Like, right? It's like having granola bars strapped all over your body. And so when you're sleeping, what do you survive on? You survive on your fat. I'm hoping this is what I survive on when I'm sleeping.
Right.
And then, but then if you're a let's say a long distance runner, you are just using your fat stores to, you're surviving on your fat. That is your fuel source. And you don't have to worry about it running out, and you don't have to worry about bonking. And so most actually in the long distance running community, and the long distance whatever community, they are now mostly fat fueling. So most of those people have shifted over to, or a sizable portion, I should say, have shifted over to a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet, because it's a much easier way to fuel yourself. And I think the top Ironman in the world right now is maybe the low carb. But I know this woman who is an Iron woman for many, many years, and she, despite being an Iron woman, she was gaining weight. She couldn't lose weight. She was training like crazy, and finally. This is not a self-serving story, but she did read my book, and she's like, I've just got this all wrong. So now she's, she is competing much more efficiently, and she's
not gaining weight.
She lost a lot of weight, actually.
So, I mean, gosh, I wish we had 2-3 more hours, and I'm not saying we're quite at the end, but there's so many areas, directions I wanted to take. I mean, love to talk about sugar. I mean, one of the things I love, I just have to tell. One of the greatest stories coming out of how the government hoodwinked us and with the food industry is that it became okay in the 90s. If you took fat out of something, if you take fat out of food, and you wrote this in your book, it doesn't taste good. So what you have to put something in. Fat is what tastes good. If you don't have fat, what's going to make it taste good? Sugar. And
salt makes
you had things like SnackWells, fat-free, calorie bomb, sugar-loaded things, but sold as healthy food to an unsuspecting public by, I think SnackWells were from Nabisco. I don't remember who, but my wife laughs about, eating those and thinking, how healthy she was being because she was eating fat-free, and all the while loading up on sugar. And so, sugar industry's got to be in here somewhere. I find it fascinating that the only thing that we don't have a daily allowance on in our dietary rules is sugar. We got a dietary allowance for everything else but sugar. And I know, Nina, you would say the daily allowance should be 0, and yet they're leaving it. And I think you're right. Sugar wasn't even part of the human diet until recent couple of 100 years. And so, where does sugar play a role in all of this nefarious activity as well? And the sugar and big sugar.
Well, our dietary guidelines say that you can have up to 10% of your calories as sugar.
That's right. You said that, but that was the latest ones, right?
That's the latest one. They tried to reduce it down to 6%, but I guess somebody objected.
Big sugar. Clearly, somebody called up somebody.
Weird.
And the thing is, I mean, just to explain about the dietary guidelines just for a second, like, it's one thing, like, you and I are free to ignore them. We can do what we want in our households. But what's really tragic about them is that they're used to formulate the school lunches, school breakfasts, feeding programs for the elderly, programs for women and infant, those food baskets for women and infant children, hospital food, everything. And they follow those formulations. So if it says 10% sugar, they're getting 10% sugar. And those are often our most vulnerable populations, right? And they're getting, so it is perfectly okay and on the menu in many schools to have donuts for breakfast. And then they'll have, like, macaroni and cheese for lunch. They're just
Carb bomb.
Pumped full of carbohydrates all the time. And these are our most vulnerable populations, which really is hugely upsetting. And you will see that obesity and diabetes and fatty liver disease rates, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, are all higher in minority Black and brown communities. I mean, all of that is just a real tragedy about these guidelines. Big sugar. I mean, I think you have to talk about, like, not just the sugar industry, but, the cereal manufacturers, the grain manufacturers, the General Mills of the Standard biscuits, Nabiscos, that all of those companies that produce foods that come from 3 basic elements, which is sugar, some kind of grain, and vegetable oils. Pretty much everything is made of that.
Yeah.
Your cookie, your chips, your snacks, your Pop-Tarts, everything is made from those ingredients. And they are they're just huge lobbies that have I mean, I think it's fair to say they've captured the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is together with Health and Human Services, they issue the dietary guidelines. But you can see that the USDA now has, what they call public-private partnerships with, and I'm not kidding when I say this, they have one with Domino's Pizza to deliver pizza to our kids. They've got one with PepsiCo to deliver all kinds of drinks and chips to kids in schools. Get your Doritos Smart Pack. It's really, and I don't even know what can be the rationale for that. But I mean, those programs and the degree to which companies have infiltrated our government policy are really shocking. But I would say that when I was doing research for my book, and what I still find in the research that I continue to do, is that those companies, they're influencing the process at every step of the way. They give money to universities. They fund professorships. They give research funding. They will, invite you to they fund the conferences, invite you to the conferences. There's a whole chapter in my book about how the whole Mediterranean diet was
I love that.
Out of
it's a marketing ploy.
Fantastic conference sponsored by the European olive oil industry that wanted to boost sales of olive oil in the United States very successfully. But they invited scientists and journalists and food writers and everybody. Everybody came and had a fantastic time in, Greece and Tunisia and Italy and everywhere. So, I mean, the food industry is incredibly savvy about how they operate at every level. And if you are not participating in their agenda, you are not getting invited to conferences. You are not a player. You're probably going to have a hard time getting a research grant or getting your paper published in one of the major journals. I mean, and I spoke to many of these scientists who had been sort of ostracized because they challenged the dogma, the conventional wisdom. They weren't playing along with the food industry, and they basically just weren't able to be scientists anymore. They couldn't really participate as scientists because they wouldn't they just weren't going along with the game. And that is also the reason why the people who have been able to challenge this conventional wisdom have been journalists like me and another one, Gary Taubes, is often many people.
Gary Taubes is awesome. Yep.
But also scientists who are not in the field of nutrition. So people from like the field of kinesthesiology, or they're working in other disciplines, but they're not in the nutrition world.
Adjacent.
Adjacent field.
Yep. Dr. Lustig. And
So I have a thought. I can tell you why donuts work for breakfast with kids. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they taste good, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're battling. And I'm by no means saying, steamed carrots don't taste good, because they're delicious.
No, they're not. They don't taste good. Stop. You're losing credibility.
Yeah. I'm with Paul on this one. I grew up on Captain Crunch, so
right.
No, I like cereal. Right.
When you're fighting, hey, I've got this cartoon character that's chasing down the big gummy pirates, right? Like it's that you're not just dealing with food now, you're dealing with sort of the psychology of advertising, right? And these little minds that are super impressionable. And I mean, we saw this with the cigarette industry back in the day, right? Like, I'm a Marlboro man, right? And we had to change the legislation about how we were promoting these things. And I mean, I think that's the challenge with sugar, is it goes so deep. I do want to, as we sort of wind down a little bit, I'd like to hit a couple things, because one of the things I'm really passionate about right now is how do we recover from the pandemic, right? Because I do really believe that food is central to that. And one of the things I tell my daughter all the time is this serving you? Are you feeling good? Is this making you better or healthier or happier? And we use that to help sort of define some of that. And I think there's a central role to food, in terms of how we're feeling and how we're recovering, even the impact of COVID on you. So love to get your take on that before we let you go.
Okay. Well, you brought up a lot of interesting points. I want to talk for 1 second about kids, because I think it's super important. So the assault on kids is everywhere. At school, they're using jelly beans to award kids for good homework. I mean, it's just everywhere. And, what the best you can do, I believe, is to have a household where you all try to eat healthfully, keep the junk food out, teach them to lead with protein first, and then you can go from there, but fill up on something healthy first. Okay. That's a key thing. I guess I'm saying, because it's worked in our household. And there's only a certain amount you can do. You can't drive yourself crazy trying to keep kids away from sugar, but you can educate them as much as possible and there's all kinds of like keto treats you can get. You can get Parmesan crackers to replace cracker. There's a lot of things out there to help you. There's something called good fat bars, which are fantastic bars you can put in your kids' lunchbox, and they have a tiny, tiny amount of sugar in them. So, I also want to say, for the grown-ups out there, that while we all think it's impossible, I can't imagine living without my Captain Crunch or my pasta, XYZ, whatever it is. What happens when you make this shift over to burning fat and eating more fat and protein? Is that very slowly your palate changes, and things that, once where you could have eaten like the whole bag of jelly beans, you're like, one or two seem really sweet to you. And I know that seems impossible to imagine myself. I was a huge sugarholic, but it does, your palate actually changes over time. And so things that were once unimaginable to you, you actually, your taste buds change. So you have to just have faith that might eventually be true, and that in the meantime, there are all these like keto snacks and things that are there for you to help you make that transition. About COVID, have been astonished throughout the entire pandemic, because I would see study after study after study come out saying people who have obesity are 9 times more likely to be be hospitalized or die. I mean, I ended up writing an article about this for a medical journal. The closest correlation between patients and poor outcomes, including death, is your high glucose, your high blood sugar, which is, remember we were talking about the blood sugar going up and down. If that's consistently high, that's because you eat too many carbohydrates, chronically eat too many carbohydrates. That was the strongest predictor of the likelihood of hospitalization and death.
Wow.
So these numbers kept coming out in every country. You know, the countries that did the worst, countries with the highest obesity rates, like Mexico and the US.
Right.
Why was there no COVID in Vietnam? Maybe it was because they're all thin there. But in every study that you could see, it had to do with diabetes, hypertension, obesity, everything that's related to the metabolic state that you get in when you chronically overconsume carbohydrates over long periods of time. And yet there wasn't a word. There was not a single word about it from the public health establishment. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about it. Nobody picked it up. And I think there are various reasons for that. One, you know, it's not a drug. It's not marketable. Diet is not marketable. And nobody makes any money off of it. If you go home today and change everything in your kitchen, you know, nobody's making, the pharmaceutical companies aren't making any money off of that. And it is an unfortunate truth that every single member of Congress gets donations from pharmaceutical companies, that, you know, a vast amount of our advertising in TV and in the media is from pharmaceutical and food companies. And also they truly don't believe in the low carbohydrate diet because most of them have been promoting the low fat diet for dozens and dozens of years. And so there's sort of this complicity, or there's this cognitive dissonance that they can't imagine that they could be wrong. And I will add one other factor, which is there is just this tremendous fear of fat shaming. So that if you say obesity is linked to poor COVID outcomes, people will say, well, you're fat shaming. And we live in an environment where to say, you know, even things that are true are politically incorrect. So, but it's, you know, again, if you think about it, like, obesity is not anybody's fault. It is because you've been given the wrong advice and you're told to do the wrong things. And even like you, Chris, you're doing everything right and you're still getting a pound or two a year. That's because you've been given the wrong advice. It's not your fault.
Yeah. I agree with all that. And so let me sort of sum up what we've talked about and the implications of that. So we've been told by our government since 1980 to eat a higher proportion of carbs than science would say is healthy for us. The result is insulin resistance, a greater skyrocketing diabetes and more heart disease, and as you said, fatty liver. Again, directly correlated. The science backs up that that's the cause. The evidence before our eyes backs up that that's the cause, and the government has not done a U-turn for the reason, like you said, it's very hard for them. In the meantime, and this is with the full support of the people that do the carbs, the oil seed producers, the grain producers, the sugar producers, all of whom have more clout apparently than the meat producers in this country. So you get everybody sick with this policy, and then you don't even, you know, the interesting thing that I've been reading about as well, and some of the other things that we read is the best way to cure early onset diabetes, or even diabetes 2, is not through some expensive drug therapy. It's stop eating carbs. Just stop, cut them out. And yet, once you get sick with these things, because the government's told you this is what you should be eating, now you go to a doctor who puts you on a drug regimen that you have to be on for the rest of your life. That doesn't cure you. That just maintains your disease, that keeps your disease from potentially killing you.
No, it gets worse.
I mean, is this
your disease will still be progressive and get worse. And and insulin, when you go on insulin, it makes you gain weight, which is, you know, which worsens your diabetes. So I mean, actually, it keeps your disease progressing along.
So how insane is all of this, Nina? And how do we get out? Is there a way? We know we shouldn't listen to the government, but as you said, there's certain people who have to, the military, the schools, the nursing homes. We know the government's been wrong time and time again. Wrong about cholesterol, wrong about fat, wrong about saturated fat. And they've even admitted to in a very subtle voice, yeah, we were wrong about that, so you can go eat eggs again. Is big agriculture and big food and big pharma and big government, is that access undefeatable? I mean, is the only way out of this, sort of the grassroots and the efforts you're doing with your coalition to at least educate some people to get off that train? Or is there a way out where we can really make substantial change in the way we treat, in the way we tell people to eat, and the way we treat food-related illnesses? Again, with change in diet before massive amounts of drugs.
Well, first of all, yes, I think it's completely insane. And the way you describe it is I believe accurate. We make people sick and then we put them on expensive pharmaceuticals, and that whole process benefits corporations, but makes people sick and miserable and lead sad and less than productive lives, and kills like 600,000 people a year.
Yep.
It's far more deadly than COVID. So what can we do? I mean, I think, the very first thing to do is to take care of your own life, your own family, your children, whatever you can do in your own household. I do suggest you read my book only because it is so hard to wrap your mind around all of the various things you have to understand. Like, what about cholesterol? And what about LDL? And what about this? And what about that? And how, what about those experiments I hear about? And so my book really it is a pretty comprehensive read. It has 150 pages of footnotes that you can look up. So I recommend that. But I do think it is going to take a grassroots movement. It's going to have to, my organization, the Nutrition Coalition, please go there and donate. But it is, we are up against massive interests, and it's really I actually have to say it's getting worse, because now there's a United Nations led attempt.
Oh, I know you talked about that in your video.
Have everyone adopt practically a vegan diet, or a quasi-vegetarian diet. So, only, 0.5 ounces a day of red meat compared to the 3.5 ounces that we eat now, and almost no eggs, almost no chicken, and some dairy, but basically, mostly cereals and grains. It would be devastating. It's nutritionally not sufficient. You can't live off of it. You can't get adequate vitamins or minerals to live or to healthfully have babies. So this is really, and that's all happening because now there is this whole sort of consensus that red meat has to be, drastically reduced or eliminated for climate change. So you have all the environmental groups behind this. We can't even get into that topic, but I would say.
I know. I was going to say, we got to have you back, because the collision, and you did it. The collision of the environmental movement with the carb movement, and that unholy alliance, where now it's not just for your health, but it's for the planet's health, and blah, 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 blah. It's taken on it's becoming more and more politicized every day.
How do you really feel, Chris?
Hey, Paul, I'm telling you, we're gonna have to have Nina back, because this is an area I'd love to spend an hour talking about as well, because you're right, Nina, and you were talking about that. Folks, how do they find that YouTube video that you just posted, that I stole these charts from, where you talk about that?
So there's, on Low Carb Down Under, is a video that I did recently on red meat, the science and politics of red meat, which I think is maybe what you saw. That's pretty interesting, and it shows that chart and talks about the politics around red meat and some of the
folks. I would tune into that after you read the book. I would tune into that.
It's just a whole other level of complexity, and it's at the United Nations level now. So, and if you think that there was a hasty consensus to make the dogma on fat and saturated fat it's like you ain't seen nothing compared to the incredibly hasty consensus that came together with zero input from any or anybody with another point of view, that this consensus that the most important thing we can do to save the planet is to get rid of meat. That is basically what the UN's position now is. Yeah. Anyway, I would say, the Nutrition Coalition, it is, you can support us. I can't say that we are large enough yet to really fight, what are hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on the other side, but it's really sort of the only chance we have. We did a lot. We actually were somewhat influential in the last set of dietary guidelines because we brought thousands of voices to the table. We got people involved. We pointed out the science. We're doing things. We have a number of really important papers coming out by top scientists. We're getting voices out there. And I think, I don't know, it has to come from the people. You can't have, it's impossible to have the dairy and meat industry fighting this fight, because they really, like any industry, lacks credibility. It has to come from the scientific community and from the people.
Yep.
So, and it has to happen because if you see the way that this movement is unfolding, the one that we're talking about at the United Nations, they're really moving very aggressively to try to implement policy measures to force people. People have not taken up fake meat with the speed that they would like. Yeah. And so now they basically have just gotten adopted to be in the school program, lunch program. I mean, they're pushing really hard to have this be our new reality without any
input from us. Sure. They want to stigmatize meat eaters, just like they stigmatize smokers and everyone else. And then it's not good. It's not good at all.
Well, I would just say that, meat is probably including liver, is the most nutritious, healthy food on the planet. That, when they address growth stunted children in Africa, they give them just like a couple of tablespoons or ounces of red meat, and that alone reverses growth stunting and reverses all kinds of cognitive problems that they have. Sure. And dairy can't do that. And they tried grains and they tried vegetables and they tried other things, but nothing. There's no food that is as powerful as meat in terms of good nutrition. So even though I know now, I have to tell you, having said that I'm from Berkeley, California, and birthplace of the vegetarian movement, and again that I myself didn't eat red meat for 20 plus years. So but there is an effort to politicize just this basic thing, which is eating an ancient healthy food that we evolved to eat.
Like Saul on the road to Damascus becoming Paul with that vegan to meat eating conversion. I like that. Paul will like that biblical reference, I know.
Well, certainly there are layers of complexity here to unravel. And honestly, I think we barely just scratched the surface. Yep. One thing we like to end the show with, Chris,
is our lightning round. And in our lightning round, I say a word and you say the first thing that pops into your head. Normally, I mean, this has evolved into something where Paul and I, there's a right answer and a wrong answer. I'm going to tell you honestly, this week, this week there isn't. No, this week there isn't. I'm going to set it up and say,
there's still a right answer.
There's no right answer. I want to know what the first thing that pops into your head when I say the word. And this week, this edition of Lightning Round is the diet edition.
Okay.
It's the diet edition. So I'm going to give you the diet and tell me in as few words as possible what pops in your head.
Okay.
Number one.
Word?
Yeah, one word, one or a few words. Yeah.
Okay.
But one word would be very traditionalist. So, okay. So first one, paleo.
Fine, but dairy's okay.
I like that because I'm a paleo with dairy. Vegan.
Nutritionally insufficient, cannot support human life.
Atkins.
The original low carb diet.
Ornish.
Uh,
Dean Ornish is another villain.
Not based on any good evidence.
Okay, I like that answer.
I have
I'm
one more
hoping you.
Ornish. Ornish was Steve Jobs' doctor.
Oh, he was.
Oh, is that right?
I did not know that. But I do know that he's a villain. He's on the list of villains, along with Ansel Keys. At least my villains. I won't have to say he's got to be everybody's villains, but my villains.
Oh goodness.
And so, all you Dean Ornish fanboys out there, all right, so you can email me in and tell me what an idiot I am. Last one, mind.
Mind?
M-I-N-D.
Mind.
Place
that is healthier when not on sugar.
Love that. It's actually a diet. It's an obscure diet, apparently, if you haven't heard of it. I'm trying to find it.
Oh, I never heard of it.
Where did I come up with it? I was going through
the mind.
But I think it's for your mind. I think your answer was awesome, because I think it's a diet designed to prevent inflammation in the brain, which helps prevent. Oh yeah, the mind diet aims to prevent mental decline and overall, quote, it's a healthy, sensible plan that has science behind it, whatever. But so yeah, so your answer was awesome, because that's the point of the diet. I don't know what's in the diet. I'm sure lots of non-inflammatory foods, because that's a word my wife throws around all the time. You can't eat that, it's inflammatory. You can't eat that, it's inflammatory. So
inflammatory.
Anyway, Nina, this has been awesome. Paul, I hope I didn't hog the mic too much.
No, you did fine.
I have 1,000 more questions. We joked that we're going to bring people back. I want to bring you back because I want to get into. We talked about the politics, but today we talked a little bit more, as I wanted to, around just the evidence that you have developed around why a high-fat, low-carb diet is better for you. And I would like to continue this at some point. Whereas, to your point, how it's become more politicized than ever. And again, we're seeing the collision of various groups coalescing around, trying to achieve the same end for different reasons. And science is nowhere to be found with any of their positions. So again, really enjoyed conversation. We never got to talk about what we were drinking. I was so excited. I am drinking ugly sparkling water, just water and natural fruit flavors.
Oh, I think I've got one of those too.
Polar seltzer.
There you go.
There's a lot of these brands, but I really don't know. It's just like water with nothing, but it's
right. It's got bubbles in it though. I just had water.
I don't know what else that's on it. Yeah. And if it were after 6 p.m., this would be red wine. So
exactly.
Right.
Pinot Noir, hopefully a Pinot Noir. That's all right.
Yeah, Pinot Noir, exactly. Well, it's been great talking to you both. I'd be delighted to come back on. It's really fun to talk.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time today. And again, if you want people to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you? You talked about the coalition.
Yeah, maybe you can put it in the show notes and I can send you some links. But, it's ninateichels.com, which nobody will be able to spell, or nutritioncoalition.us. And those are really the two best places to get a hold of me. On Twitter, which is the only place I'm really active on social media, I'm at Big Fat Surprise.
There you go.
Awesome. There you go. Okay, folks. And again, this will change your life. There's no book I have ever read that had such an impact on me. And it's a fun read. You talked about the LDL, LDH, and HD, blah, blah, blah. But even when Nina gets sciencey, even a guy like me, a simple suburban boy.
I'm a simple man.
A simple suburban boy like me can understand what's the point she's making. So it doesn't talk over the heads of us simple suburban boys or simple Southern boys like Paul. So get a copy of the book, read it. It will change your life.
Okay. Thank you. It's so great to talk to you both.
Thanks very much.
Paul, talk again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
What a great episode. Was it not?
Yeah. I hope you all enjoyed that. It as I was just telling Paul, it inspired me to get back into a very strict high-fat, low-carb diet in order to get more in fighting weight. I mean, as I said in the program, a few years ago, I lost 50 pounds on it over the course of 12 months. But yeah, if you don't stick with it religiously, it's some of it's going to creep back on. So I'm feeling great about the fact that for the last 2 weeks, I've been, very high fat, low carb, and I'm feeling great. So it works.
It's hard though, Chris, and I think that's the really important thing, because I came in a bit as a skeptic, right?
Yep.
I wouldn't say skeptic, but I didn't have the knowledge that you had, and I think the thing that came very clear to me was just the amount of dependence we have on sugar, right? Like, just it's everywhere, and
yep.
And I have not made. Well, I have made a bunch of changes. My changes are a little different than yours. I with the pandemic, decided to start running again, right? And I have back pain, and so I had to sort of wedge that in. It was really good last year, and so what I did this year was did a virtual race across Tennessee. It's 1,000 kilometers over 4 months. It's nuts, right?
Yep.
But what was helpful, and so like, it's, we both have the same goals. And honestly, I think that's one of the things I love about you is we often have the same goals. We just arrive at the outcomes differently, right? But I think the thing that was so interesting to me about Nina's interview was just the dependence on sugar. And if you can make small changes, reduce your sugar intake, right? Instead of having that cookie, grab a carrot just once, right? Like, that's a win. And so what happens is it really becomes interesting. You become aware of your own dependence on sugar. I know I do.
I was buying breakfast sausage this morning because, again, one on
it's delicious.
The way I'm eating is eggs and sausage, eggs with cheese and sausage.
Is delicious.
So yeah, you're not like you're hard done by in eating a strict keto diet. But as I'm looking through on the store shelves down here in Alabama at the Winn-Dixie, there was sugar even in breakfast sausage.
But at the same time, sometimes that breakfast sausage is laced with maple syrup, and that's delicious.
No, that's not. Then that's sneaking sugar, sneaking carbs. That you don't. I finally found a brand that didn't have any added sugar. So, but it's interesting. And again, but Paul, and not that I don't also a big believer in the power of exercise. I work out, as you know, every day, either on a elliptical machine or with weights, like a back and forth. But as Nina said, you really can't exercise your way out of weight or into weight loss. It's really
it's a combination. It's a combination of factors. You got to kick up your metabolism and reduce your intake.
Right. Well,
it's math.
Well, it's not even reduce your intake, because I don't reduce my calories on this high fat, low carb diet. I reduce my intake of again, the key there is reduce your intake of carbohydrates and sugar. That's how you lose weight.
Well, what I don't like about that is the reduction of alcohol. I mean, that's the
I mean, there are certain things we can ignore. Let's face it. All these diets are a little bit of cafeteria selection. I'll keep the alcohol in my diet. I'll eliminate the yogurt ice cream bars.
Chris, we jumped right into this, and who we didn't even say hello to, because we haven't seen him in almost a year because of this pandemic thing.
And there he is.
None other than the producer, David. David, how the heck are you?
Hey guys, doing well. It's good to be here. Happy to be back. I want to apologize. I don't know if you can notice, I'm doing some renovations to my home office, and I was hoping to be done by the time we bring season 6 back, but I'm just not quite done. Hopefully by next week I should be done putting things back together.
That looks a little bit like the Bat Cave. David, do you have anything to share with us?
No.
Let me ask a question, because we're on the subject of diet. David, where do you sit on these various diets? On the Atkins diet, which is sort of high fat, low carb; on the keto, kind of the same thing. The paleo diet, the Mediterranean diet, the South Beach diet. Where are you to diet tomorrow? And we know, and Paul and I know that you're ripped and in tip top shape. You don't go on about
as the kids say.
Yeah, right, as the kids say. But were you to diet, or were you to advise somebody? What dietary advice would you have for our audience?
Well, I'm picking up a lot by proxy from you guys. Honestly, I'm so unqualified to answer. And Paul and I have talked about this recently, how I'm still in that place where I can eat whatever I want, and I'm just fine. And so I'm experiencing, I know it's one of three things. It's either A, I'm on borrowed time, and it's going to just kick on one day and I'm just going to.
And that's true. That is true.
Or B, it could just be I won the genetic lottery.
And there is that too. I hate those people. Everyone hates those people.
And then option C, which I assume is most likely, is that I'm rotting from the inside out because of what I eat and the way I treat my body. So I assume that any day now I'm just gonna
there's an option D that potentially, Paul, replace your regular full-length mirror with a funhouse mirror. So you're getting this distorted view of when you look at yourself and go, you're looking pretty good.
Dang, I'm looking good today.
Yeah, maybe that's because, I don't know. So I would check that mirror. Yeah, you put a few other objects in it, your dogs, and see if they're misshapen by that. But what were you going to say, Paul?
No, just the same thing is I remember my stage in life at that stage where it wasn't a concern and I didn't have those issues, and it's a blessing. At the same time, many of our listeners are sort of in the same stage that David is. And some of them are, sort of in between us and them. And some of them are right where we are. And the reality is, as you get older, you have to be more aware of this stuff. And so, I hope, really, really hope, David, that you don't have to deal with weight gain. But the reality is you probably will, as most Americans, most people do. And so, come back, watch this episode, watch it multiple times. David, take notes. I think you're going to really like it.
And buy a copy. David and all our fans out there, get a copy of The Big Fat Surprise. It's a hugely interesting. She's such a great author. It's not just it's not some scientific mumbo jumbo. It tells a story. It tells a story of how we got to where we are, and with great examples from around the world. It's just, again, I enjoyed the book. As I said in the program, I got it as a lark for my wife, and ended up reading it and opened my eyes. And everyone in my family's sick of me talking about high fat, low carb, but that's the converts are usually the most evangelical, as they say in when it comes to religion, and I think when it comes to things like diet. And I'm not saying diets, because it's not a diet the net result of it is you lose weight, but it's a diet around just a way of eating.
It's a lifestyle thing.
Exactly.
So if you've stuck around with us this long, and we're grateful that you have, please please subscribe. But the other thing is, we're sort of still figuring out what does season 6 look like. We're certainly looking at it from the perspective of how do we recover from COVID. And I think, here we are back, here I am back with family in Idaho, and it's been fantastic to reconnect. But there's so much more here. There's no playbook for this, right? We've never been down this path before, where, basically you take off a year from your life. And so, we're going to be talking about that here in season 6. And we'd love your perspective, love who you'd like us to talk to. Who are the people that you'd like to hear from? So please, please, please give us that feedback. Email geekscoffee@gmail.com, Slack at us, Twitter at us, Instagrams at us, all the things. We want to hear from you. So anyway, thanks. Appreciate everything. And it's good to be back.
Yeah, good to be back, and we'll see you next week.
Sounds good.